Or maybe.
So. Okay, good evening and welcome to our 7th Kilner Bioethics Lectureship, which this year serves as the first event in our 2025 Spring Bioethics Colloquium Series, hosted by Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. I'm Michael Sleesman. I'm the director and faculty member in our bioethics degree program, and I'm pleased to introduce this evening's lecture. For more than 3 decades, Trinity has had a long-standing emphasis on the Christian cultural engagement of bioethical issues, offering courses in distinctly Christian scholarship and reflection at the crossroads of medicine, science, technology, and our individual and common humanity. One individual who is central to the development of bioethics here at Trinity throughout his entire tenure with TEDS is Dr. John Kilner, who I'm pleased has been able to join us this evening. Dr. Kilner is Professor Emeritus of Bioethics and Cultural Engagement, and he is the individual for whom this lectureship has been named. Prior to his retirement in 2019, Dr. Kilner served as a faculty member for 26 years, in addition to having served as the founding director of our bioethics degree program and as the first president and CEO of the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity, serving from 1994 to 2005. Through this bioethics lectureship, we continue to honor Dr. Kilner's contributions both in the classroom and to the broader work of Christian bioethics, and we are grateful to the donors who have made this endowed lectureship possible. To keep my introductory comments brief, I'll just mention a few things that are related to bioethics at Trinity that you may be interested in. The first is to highlight the work of my colleagues at the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity, most specifically their upcoming 36th annual summer conference. You heard that right, 36th. 32nd. Incorrect. 32nd annual summer conference. Dr. Epernet's looking at me. No, not 36 quite yet. A few more years. Living in the biotech century, the first 25 years. As one of the leading global venues for Christian bioethical engagement, I encourage you to attend their upcoming conference this June, either in person or virtually. To learn more about their conference and the center's work more broadly, including other opportunities like their book discussions, please visit their website at cbhd.org. Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, where I serve on the faculty, offers both a master's degree and a number of graduate certificates related to bioethics. Our 36 credit hour Master's in Ethics, Theology, and Culture, which we will be launching this upcoming fall, offers concentrations in bioethics, intercultural studies, or human flourishing. The program is offered in a variety of delivery formats and can be pursued through in-person, hybrid, and fully online options, fully remote options, that is. In addition, we offer a number of 12 credit hour graduate certificates, one in pro-life advocacy and engagement, another in Hippocratic healthcare ethics, a third in ethics and Christian faithfulness, and a new executive certificate in Christian ethics, the church, and society. Those, along with our master's degree, are all designed to be accessible to both full-time students and busy professionals pursuing part-time studies, including those whose jobs or family situations make relocating to our on-campus experience impossible. For more information about our degree and certificate options, please visit our university website at tiu.edu/bioethics. In addition to these educational opportunities, Trinity also publishes the journal Ethics in Medicine. As one of the oldest continually published periodicals in Christian bioethics, Ethics in Medicine recently celebrated its 40th anniversary of publishing, in which it has been dedicated to advancing bioethical scholarship consistent with the values and commitments of Christian Hippocratism. To learn more about our journal, access its free archives, or to become a subscriber, please visit the website ethicsinmedicine.com. I also would like to invite you back to join us for the 2 remaining lectures in our 2025 Spring Bioethics Colloquium Series, which will be held on April 3rd and April 10th, respectively, and we will host lectures by Drs. Peter Jaggard and Dr. Gregory Webster. More information about those upcoming virtual events will be available via Trinity's event calendar, as well as our Eventbrite page. Finally, a few housekeeping matters. Dr. Hollinger's presentation will last about an hour, followed by a time of question and answer. Those joining remotely can submit your questions at any time during the presentation via the chat on YouTube. And so feel free to do that as the talk is going on. Once Dr. Hollinger concludes his presentation, we'll get to as many of your questions as our time will allow before our 8:30 conclusion time. For students in the Bioethics Colloquium class, we will reconvene for those meeting here in person in the CBHD conference room, and those meeting via Zoom, joining us via the Zoom session around 8:45. So rejoin at about that time. And now to the reason for our evening tonight. Our speaker is Dr. Dennis Hollinger. Dr. Hollinger is no stranger to bioethics at Trinity, having been both an MDiv alum of TEDS, as well as a regular speaker at CBHD events, currently serving as a distinguished fellow with the Center's Academy of Fellows. And he's previously served as a visiting professor for our bioethics courses for a number of years, teaching courses related to the annual summer conference. Beyond his relationship to TEDS, Dr. Hollinger has served in many distinguished capacities. He is the President Emeritus and Distinguished Senior Professor of Christian Ethics at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary, where he served as president, and the Colman M. Mockler Distinguished Professor of Christian Ethics from 2008 to 2019. He also served in a number of other academic appointments at schools such as Evangelical Theological Seminary, Messiah College, and others, and previously served as a pastor in Washington, D.C. Dr. Hollinger is the author of many writings, including 5 books and nearly 100 articles, most of which are related to the areas of ethics, bioethics, and church and society more broadly. His most recent volume, which I highly recommend if you have not already purchased it, is Creation in Christian Ethics, God's Design for Humanity and the World. Another of his works was one of the very first books that I assigned for my first class that I ever taught as an educator, and the book was Choosing the Good, Christian Ethics in a Complex World, and I still recommend that one regularly to students. So thank you, Dr. Hollinger, for all of these important works. For our bioethics students here at Trinity, one of his articles back from 1989, Can Bioethics Be Evangelical, is one of the most frequently cited articles in the papers that I receive as a faculty member. And it's often the article that students will refer to the most in class discussions as well. And so just really want to highlight the important contributions that you've made to the field of Christian bioethics as a whole. Having benefited from his writings as a student, an early career educator, I was delighted to meet and first interact with Dennis when I began my work at the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity a number of years ago, and have been blessed by our interactions and your continued scholarly contributions in the years since those first encounters. It's a great joy and privilege for me to welcome you back to our campus. Dr. Hollinger, as this year's Kilner Bioethics Lecturer, will you please join me in welcoming him as he presents Autonomy in Bioethics, Critiques, and an Alternative. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, and it is really wonderful to be with you this evening. Those of you here in person and more of you at a distance. Always good to be back on the campus at Trinity. I had wonderful years here as a student, 1972 to 1975. Marianne and I had just gotten married that summer and started life together in this area. And I owe so much to Trinity. It was great preparation for my pastoral ministry, my academic work, and my leadership roles, and always grateful for it, grateful for the center. And it's also very special tonight to be here in the lectureship named after my friend, Dr. John Kilner. John has made such a significant contribution to the field of bioethics from an evangelical perspective, helping to start the center here on campus, many of his early writings and continued writings over the years. But for me, I think more significantly is the many conversations we had over the years. And John, I've always appreciated that so much. You've been a wonderful colleague and friend, and so just an honor to be here in this lecture this evening. I've entitled the lecture this evening, Autonomy and Bioethics, Critiques and an Alternative. And obviously, we need to start by talking a little bit about the rise of autonomy and bioethics. I think it's safe to say that the concept really goes back to a work that was first written in 1977 by Beecham and Childress called The Principles of Biomedical Ethics. It is now in its 8th edition, and I just heard this evening actually that Beecham passed away. He was at Georgetown for many years, and James Childress was at the University of Virginia. But 8 editions of this book, the last one being in 2019. The heart of the book, and it's, 500-600 pages, but the meat of it is focused on 4 major principles which have become key in the field of bioethics. Autonomy, non-maleficence, that is, do no harm, beneficence, that is, do what benefits the patient, and of course, the principle of justice. And these 4 principles have become bedrock in most medical ethics writings and in medical ethics committees. The principles are known widely, not just in academic circles and medical circles, but also just in the broad arena of people who are interested in the field of medicine and want to talk a little bit, at least, about moral or ethical foundations. I think it's safe to say that autonomy is the most dominant ethical category in bioethics today. What is autonomy in bioethics? Well, Beecham and Childress define it this way. It's the personal rule of the self that is free from controlling interference of others and from personal limitations that prevent meaningful choice, such as inadequate understanding. Another place, they define it this way: the autonomous individual freely acts in accordance with a self-chosen plan. What's needed for the principle to be active, for it to really work? Well, a number of things that they mention. And others, of course, have picked up on this as well. One is certainly understanding. Sufficient for the person to make their own decision in light of their own values so that there can be informed consent. And informed consent, of course, becomes a very cardinal understanding in the field of medicine in general and in bioethics. Also, no controlling influences, either from physicians or institutions or from other people. Beecham and Childress and others have argued that autonomy can only be overridden by competing moral considerations, such as endangering public health, potential harm to others, or scarce resources. It's certainly to be balanced by commitments to the other 3 principles, but in practice, it really does appear to ascend to the top in bioethical writings and I think in many ethics committees. I serve on the Healthcare Ethics Committee, a large public hospital in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I think I've never done a real full analysis of this, but my sense is that autonomy has been the thing appealed to the most as we deal with difficult cases. And as I've talked to other people on other ethics committees in various settings, they have often said the same. One of the major goals has certainly been to limit medical paternalism or physician-centric decisions. And certainly in all of this, in their writings over the decades, Beecham and Childress tried to avoid what they called a radical individualism, as they described autonomy. And noteworthy, they have responded to the critics over the years. Part of the reason for 8 different editions is you've had so many new issues that emerge in the field of medicine and in biotechnology. That's part of it, but there have been various critiques that have been rendered, and they've attempted to respond to those and to incorporate new understandings. But still, even in the midst of this, I think it's safe to say that autonomy has remained the dominant category. Clearly, there have been other statements on autonomy in the medical world. Most of them go back to Kant, the philosophy of Kant, to John Stuart Mill, who once said speaking of the human person, his independence is absolute over himself, over his own body and mind. The individual is sovereign. And in many ways, you could almost just lift that out of many bioethics writings today, even that goes back to John Stuart Mill. Here are a couple of examples of statements on autonomy in the medical world. The British Medical Association. It is a respect for patient autonomy, which is probably the single most talked about principle or concept in medical ethics, a cornerstone of medical law. Or the World Health Organization. In a recent article dealing with artificial intelligence, in calling for safe and ethical AI for health, the first principle is protect autonomy. And we can find statements in the NIH, CDC, AMA, the American Medical Association, in which autonomy is heralded as a key for medical practice today and for medical ethics. And I need to note, before we get to the critiques, that there are certainly positive aspects to autonomy. I'll try to incorporate some of these positive aspects under a different category at the end as I propose a different alternative. But certainly things that we allowed that are very closely associated and are connected by Beecham and Childress in their works on autonomy. Informed consent, limitations on unmerited influence, and the rejection of medical paternalism. We all know that there's a very dark history in the field of medicine and medical research of things that were done to patients over the years. And in many ways, the whole concept of autonomy and informed consent, limitations on unmerited influence, all of these things really came out of some of the abuses that took place over the years. And so I want to note at the very beginning, there's some very positive things to be said about autonomy, even though with the concept there are problems. And I wish they had come up with a different concept. I think it would have helped us much more in the field of bioethics. So we're going to do some critiques of autonomy. I'm going to look at three areas of critiques. One will be social and behavioral sciences, and particularly as they have dealt with some of the realities of aloneness and isolation, which are very much associated with the concept of autonomy. Secondly, we'll look at biblical theological critiques and attempt to understand that we were created and we exist as relational beings, not autonomous beings. And then thirdly, we'll look at ethical critiques and particularly some of the impacts of autonomy in various areas of bioethics. And then in its place, I'll try to set forth an alternative in place of autonomy. So let's start with social behavioral science critiques. One of the first persons to note shifts from a sense of community to isolation or autonomy was Harvard professor Robert Putnam in this book, Bowling Alone, 25 years ago in the year 2000. What Putnam noticed was that people were no longer doing life together. He noticed that community associations were no longer drawing people in the same way. He noticed that even gatherings in church associations seemed to be declining already in the year 2000. He noted that common interest kind of groups that used to gather around common interests were no longer drawing the same number of people. And when it came to bowling, he noticed that people were no longer bowling as much in leagues, and rather they were bowling alone. And hence the metaphor for his book, Bowling Alone. He believes there are significant results of all of this. The result is a loss of trust, a loss of social capital, and a loss of societal norms, which he believes are really important for a culture to flourish and to maintain itself. And thus, as he describes it in this book, both individuals as well as society are negatively impacted. He, of course, is retired a number of years ago. He's up in his 80s, and he is still doing some writings and lecturing. He recently did a film. And in some of his recent statements about social isolation and the move away from community to autonomy, or what he calls isolation, he notes the impact on democracy. And I'll come back to that a bit more in a few moments. If we come into our own present time, what we find is that isolation, aloneness on college campuses has led to what many have called loneliness as a new epidemic. This is not a staged picture, by the way. It is from UCLA, and my thanks to Tom Lynn, the president of Varsity. Tom was our mission speaker at our church in Charlotte a couple of weeks ago. And during our Sunday school time, he gave a wonderful lecture of what's happening on college campuses today. And he had this, and I shot the photo off of his, what was on the screen, so his shot was a little bit clear. But this was not staged. It is, I believe, at UCLA. And it typifies the sense of isolation, aloneness, autonomy, if you will, that has led to what many have called a new epidemic in our society, the sense of loneliness. Surveys show that a significant percentage of college students, college university students, are feeling isolated, left out, lacking companionship, and as a result, a great deal of anxiety. And we know from studies that are done every year on the mental health of college university students, more and more students are going to the mental health clinics on their campus, are receiving counseling to deal with the sense of anxiety which many are seeing as being directly related to the isolation, the sense of loneliness that many are experiencing. And I would suggest to us that for a number of these individuals, the philosophy of autonomy is at the heart of that. People want to be left alone. It's a concept heard again and again by researchers. There are certainly global impacts of aloneness or autonomy. Growing loneliness in various countries around the world, and COVID-19 only exacerbated that. I think we know that. But as a result, the United Kingdom appointed a minister of loneliness. Japan did the same thing, a minister of loneliness. And in Japan, which traditionally we would have thought of as a more communal society, Japan has experienced a major problem of loneliness with youth and the elderly dying alone. What has been noted in Japan is that more and more families just have one child. Often the child is not living in the same vicinity as the parents. One parent dies, the other is left, and they are finding that many individuals are dying alone only to be found because of the stench of a dead body in an apartment complex. And that's partly what led to the appointment of a minister of loneliness. Derek Thompson wrote an article in The Atlantic just in the last month, in February 2025, called The Anti-Social Century. He begins this article by talking about going to a restaurant in the area where he lives. And when he went into the restaurant, it was full of food up on the counters, but virtually no one in the restaurant to eat. A few people behind the counter, they were having hardly any interaction at all with the people who came in to pick up their order. And as Thompson began to reflect on that, it sent him into a search for various kinds of researches going on today about this new sense of autonomy, aloneness, and loneliness. You can think of autonomy as kind of the principle, if you will, and loneliness as the psychological reality that people experience when they are living life alone. He notes that research has found that 74% of all restaurant traffic is off-premises customers eating alone. And the number one reason that they give is me time, autonomy. Americans spend less time with others than in any other period for which we have data going back to 1965. Men spend 7 hours in front of TV for every hour hanging out with someone. Typical female pet owners spend more time engaged with a pet than they do with friends. Research has shown that half of teenage girls feel persistently sad or hopeless, alone, even though they're very much connected on their devices and connected in terms of social media and the like. Sedentary leisure or leisure alone is more common than engaged leisure, that is, leisure with others, according to research. And single men without kids who have the most leisure time on their hands overwhelmingly are likely to spend hours by themselves, which then limits their abilities and any preparation for a life of marriage. And I think a fascinating book that just came out this fall that really chronicles some of this is the book by Brad Wilcox, sociologist at the University of Virginia, very committed Roman Catholic believer, I might add it. And in this book, he notes that more and more college students and really people between the ages of 21 and about 40 have a great aversion to marriage. It's too impinging upon their way of life. They prefer a life of autonomy and loneliness. And therefore, reticence to marriage, a bedrock institution of society, as Brad Wilcox puts it. In his study, the 2023 study of American men found that 2/3 of surveyed men between the ages of 18 and 23 said, "No one really knows me." And so I think it's quite clear that there are civic and emotional impacts of aloneness. Vivek Murthy, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who was the Surgeon General under the last administration, before he left the office, wrote a little booklet entitled The Epidemic of Loneliness. And he noted that the health effects of loneliness resulting from this sense of autonomy, the health effects are on par with obesity and tobacco use. Research has shown that people who spend time alone are less happy. They feel less satisfied and less integrated in their lives as a holistic being. Increasingly, it divides people so that it's hard to meet people who are different than ourselves. And this was one I found very interesting. 1/3 of Republican college students said they would never date a Democrat. And 2/3 of Democrat college students said they would never date a Republican. And these were the kinds of things that many were concerned about. I mean, even if we go back to the Bowling Alone book, what does this do to civic life when we are committed primarily to a life of aloneness, a life of autonomy? And it particularly has ramifications for living together in a democracy and trying to make a democracy work. And I think many of the tensions, perhaps, that we're experiencing in our society today with regards to democratic features probably are somehow related to this concept of autonomy and living isolated or alone lives. And so, from a sociological and a psychological perspective, autonomy breeds loneliness. It's unhealthy physically and psychologically. And here I might mention the book, the broadly heralded book by Jonathan Haidt, social psychologist at NYU, called The Anxious Generation. And we looks at what our devices are doing to the minds, especially of children and teenagers, what it's doing to the minds and to the bodies. He knows that children are experiencing less traditional playtime and are more and more alone in their play. It's keeping individuals from personal encounters with others. It's breeding anxiety. And as he documents it, it's actually affecting brain patterns in negative ways. It's contrary to living together in community and as a nation, and therefore contrary to the very nature of democracy. Hannah Arendt, in her book, The Human Condition, I think put it well. All human activities are condoned by the fact that humans live together. And as she describes it, when we are no longer attentive to the social nature of our being, it has dire effects upon ourselves and upon our world. Let me come then to a second level of critique of autonomy, and that is biblical theological critique. The starting point in all of this, of course, is creation. We are created for community, not autonomy. Communion with God, but also communion with each other. Genesis 2:18, it is not good for the man to be alone. We usually link this to marriage because the institution of marriage comes just right after this. But I think in many ways this statement is also a statement about our sociality, about our communal nature. It is not good for the human person to be alone. Self-rule is not God's design. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, which precedes chapter 2 conceptually, and chapter 2 simply picks up and gives further ramification to what we find in Genesis 1. In the image of God, He created them, male and female, He created them. And of course, and John has written a whole book on the image of God and human dignity, wonderful book, but lots of debates about what it means that we're created in the image of God. And I'll return to the whole concept a little bit later in my lecture this evening. But one of the suggestions is that being created in the image of God has relational dimensions to it. And it's interesting here that you have a relationality in the context of the reference to the image of God. In the image of God, He created them male and female. There is a duality to human beings. As a matter of fact, no human being would exist without that duality. You have to have male, female to come together for another human being to exist. And by the way, I think it's always important that we read Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 together, because Jesus read them together in His discourse on divorce in Matthew, the 19th chapter. Herman Bavinck, the Dutch theologian, in one of his writings, where he's dealing with Genesis 1:27, describes the radical sexual duality of man, which is the root of all other fellowship. That is, out of that duality of creating humans in His image, male and female creating them, there is the foundation, the root of all other interactions with human beings. And therefore, what we find in chapter 2, verse 18, it is not good for the man to be alone. Clearly, the cultural mandate, as we often refer to it in the creation story, requires a working together. Bringing children into the world, we cannot do it alone. The caring and stewarding of this beautiful, good world that God has created really requires a communal effort, a working together. The carrying out of labor in order to enrich the world and develop the world further cannot be done in isolation. It involves that community dimension, not a sense of autonomy. And so a starting point, and some of what I talked about in my book that Michael mentioned a few moments ago, Creation and Christian Ethics, is to see so much richness there in the creation story that is pertinent theologically, but is also pertinent for our reflections on ethics. And that, I think, is a starting point when we think about a critique of autonomy. We also, when we're thinking about biblical theological critique, need to look at the Old Testament and the call of God's people as a people. God certainly called individuals like Abraham, Moses, and the prophets, but it was always with a view towards calling out a covenant people, a community. And thus the frequent language, the people of God, my people. I didn't look up how many times people language occurs in the Old Testament, but it is a lot. God dealt with individuals, to be sure, but it was always in the context of a community. And thus, in Exodus 19:5, just before the giving of the Decalogue, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Deuteronomy 14, verse 2, you are a people holy to the Lord your God, and out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, the Lord has chosen you to be his treasured possession. All of us as individuals are created in the image of God, but individuals are always in community, never autonomous followers of Yahweh. I doubt very much whether Hebrew believers very much talked about it, and in other words, they seldom would have talked about my personal relationship with Yahweh. I think it would have always been, most always, our relationship with Yahweh. Because they did not understand the human self in isolation from others. It was always the human self as part of a family, part of a kin network, and part of the people of God. When we come to the New Testament, God calls out a church, his body. The church, not autonomous individuals, is the heart of New Testament faith. And so when people come to Christ, they come into a community. It's impossible for a person to say, I want to come to faith in Christ, but I have no interest in the church. I want Jesus, but I don't want his body. That's an impossibility. If a person is in Christ, they are in the body of Christ. For when we come to faith in Christ, we join his community. And that means we are called then really to join a visible community of the church here on this earth. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, you're a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God, picking up very much in Old Testament language. And when we come to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, descriptions about spiritual gifts, to each one the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. I think all of us, when we think about the gifts that God may have endowed to us, recognize that yes, we benefit from those gifts individually, but God did not give the gifts primarily for our autonomous good or for our individual and even spiritual benefit. He gave it for the common good, for the building up of the body of Christ. And therefore, I think it's safe to say that biblical faith is from start to finish a critique of the concept of autonomy. John Donne put it so well in this poem in the 17th century, well-known British poet, and of course an Anglican cleric. He wrote, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. Therefore, never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." That is a rich poem theologically. Very, very rich. And it is very much a critique of the autonomy that we find in our world today. But thirdly, I want to come to the ethical side of all of this, an ethical critique of autonomy. Today, it is often said that autonomy, and especially in the realm of ethics, is really rooted in, or at least expressed in, what Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, called expressive individualism. Charles Taylor noted that individual human flourishing is the goal in the mind of what he called the secular age of our time. He said, a new self-understanding of our social existence exists, one which gave an unprecedented primacy to the individual. Another place, understanding that each one of us has his or her own way of realizing our humanity, and that it is important to find and live out one's own as against surrendering to conformity with the model imposed on us from the outside. And Taylor in his writings, and if any of you have tried to dip into Charles Taylor, you know it's not the easiest reading, but he sees this really as new in human history. Traditionally, ethics was always conformity to something external to the self. And I think this was true in almost any system of ethics, any religious ethics you look at. Ethics was conforming my life to something outside of myself, some kind of principle, some kind of basic understanding. I mean, even in utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. It's not an isolated kind of understanding. And so Taylor is seeing that something new has really come into the picture here in recent years with this expressive individualism, which we might say is autonomy gone amok, if you will. Others write about this. Carter Snead, professor of law at the University of Notre Dame, in his book, What It Means to Be Human, The Case of the Body in Public Bioethics, says that expressive individualism begins with the premise that the fundamental unit of human reality is the individual person, considered as separate and distinct from being embedded in a web of social relations, a concept of isolation of the individual. Later, he says in the book, the vision of personhood understands human flourishing as the pursuit of projects of one's own invention and choosing. And many of these writers point very much to a looking internally to one's own feelings to define themselves and to understand their own selfhood. Carl Trueman, in The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which I know a lot of evangelicals have read in recent years, he says, we think of it, the world, much more as a case of raw material that we can manipulate by our own power to our own purposes. Self-creation is a routine part of our modern social imaginary. And thus, I think what we can say is that autonomy and expressive individualism are at the heart of numerous bioethics expressions today. It's not just the more tame autonomy principle set forth by Beecham and Childress. In many ways, it has been extended much further, and we'll see this in a moment as we delve into a few of the ethical issues and the way autonomy relates to them. I need to note in all of this, of course, that individualism has a long history in the United States. The old Daniel Boone saying, at least attributed to Daniel Boone, when I see the smoke from my neighbor's chimney, I know it's time to move on. And that's in part what really led to the frontier development. People saw the smoke from the neighbor's chimney. I don't want neighbors too close, time to move on. So we've had a very strong individualism that has been noted way back in United States history. But I think what we can say is that has intensified in recent years with the more modern notion of autonomy and expressive individualism. Let's look at the impact then on some of the ethical issues. The impact of autonomy on reproductive technologies. The baby-making business is about manufacturing children according to our personal designs. And it was Oliver O'Donovan who first of all noted the danger of turning procreation into manufacturing. His book, Begotten Not Made, written in 1984, really in the very early stages of the new reproductive technologies. Donor gametes, in vitro fertilization, surrogacy, allow for design of babies, bringing children into the world outside the dyad of husband and wife, and increasingly we see singles, gay individuals, and surrogates bringing children into the world, and in the midst of this, also selecting children as we want. This is supplemented in many ways by pre-implantation genetic diagnosis or by amniocentesis, where we can actually do the analysis of the person to be, or the person that really is, we would say, and choose the ones we want according to our liking. The impetus in reproduction then gives way to an autonomous ethic in which essence is gone. And by this I mean an essence regarding the nature of human beings, the nature of children, the nature of sex, the nature of reproduction. Rather, it is now according to my will, rather than thinking about these realities that we've always understood in terms of bringing children into the world, that there's a meaning, there's an essence, there's some givens that are there about the nature of procreation, about the nature of children, and about human nature. Or let's think about autonomy in abortion. Roe v. Wade in 1973 grounded the right to an abortion in the right of privacy, which is essentially another word for autonomy. And this was 4 years before Beecham and Childress wrote their book, Principles of Biomedical Ethics. The argument here was that one has a right over their own body, which needs to be the overriding commitment. Of course, and I often like to point this out, a right over one's body negates a prior decision that by its very nature was reproductive in nature. That is, when an individual says, I want to have a right over my own body, it is a contradiction to the fact that unless it was a case of rape, they entered into a sexual relationship that by its very nature carried with it the potential for offspring. And in one sense, we've simply forgotten the most basic elements about physicality and physical life and sexuality that all human beings all throughout history have understood, except for us moderns and postmoderns. Abortion as health care is only really true when the woman's life is at stake, even though it is more and more referred to as a health care issue. And I would say not only when the life is at stake, but when there is severe medical issues associated with the pregnancy. Autonomy, it seems to me, drives the abortion ethos, not the right and the dignity of the child in the womb. Or let's think for a moment about post-human enhancement. I could have referred to this as the transhuman enhancement. I don't see much difference really between posthumanism and transhumanism, so I'm trying to make some demarcations between the two, but I'll simply put them together. Defining posthumanism, seeking to transcend human givens through biotechnologies. In many ways, those who embrace the posthuman world and the posthuman philosophy argue that it's an attempt to control the evolutionary process. And various individuals, such as Nick Bostrom and Kurzweil and Sobolescu and others, talk about our ability and our desire, our design to actually control the evolutionary process, as they put it, rather than allowing the natural process to control us. Their argument is that humans will be totally different than from what we know now. And autonomy is a major presupposition in the midst of all of this. Let me give you a couple of quotes that I think make these points very, very well. One from Ray Kurzweil, and Kurzweil, as many of you perhaps know, taught at MIT for a while. His research enabled face recognition technologies, and so if you have used your phone today in a face recognition dimension of your phone, it goes back to Kurzweil. Known for popularizing the concept of singularity, that point in which a human being will be as much machine as biological human. The more and more through biotechnologies we will become machines themselves. And he writes this: the singularity will allow us to transcend limitations of our biological bodies and brains. We will gain power over our fates. Our mortality will be in our own hands. We will be able to live as long as we desire. Or Julian Sobolescu, who teaches at Oxford, and Bostrom is at Oxford as well. He believes we have a moral imperative to permanently improve the genetic lot of future humanity through genetic engineering. And he writes The next stage of human evolution will be rational evolution, where we select children who not only have the greatest chance of surviving, reproducing, and being free of disease, but who have the greatest opportunities to have the best lives in their likely environment. That seems to me to be basically a kind of new brand of eugenics, and clearly moving in that direction. Or let's think about autonomy and end-of-life issues. Ideally, it seems to me that treatment termination, when treatment is terminated of a patient who is really on their deathbed, who is near death, and in which the treatment would only prolong the dying process, that decision should involve family and friends. Some of the saddest cases I have seen in the Healthcare Ethics Committee in which I work are cases that come to us in which the patient is not, has no advance directive, is not able to make any kind of cognitive judgment about their own situation and decision, and there is no family, there are no friends to help in the process, to serve as a surrogate. And we see a lot of this, and I could give you all kinds of examples, and of course I can't really delineate some of the things that we encounter in that committee. But oftentimes you see difficulties at the end of life where individuals have great difficulty because they are no longer surrounded by a group of people in our autonomous generation. Medical assistance in dying, which used to be called physician-assisted suicide, is rooted in autonomy and expressive individualism. And I, by the way, find it interesting the way in which the language on ethical issues often changes over time. Used to be euthanasia, then it became physician-assisted suicide. Suicide seemed too strong, too strident language, and so we move now to what is the common parlance in the last several years, medical assistance in dying. And when you look at the arguments for it, and as it comes up in various state legislatures, we now have 10 states that have passed medical assistance in dying legislation, Washington, D.C. in addition, and there are bills that are even right now before various states. I think that autonomy is really very much at the heart of the arguments. In one sense, this is not old. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher in the first century, said, "Just as I shall select my ship when I am about to go on a voyage, or my house when I propose to take a residence, so I shall choose my death when I am about to depart from life." And it seems to me that with today's autonomy and expressive individualism, the push for medical assistance in dying will only increase in the years ahead. But let me take another issue, and you may not always think of this as a bioethical issue, but it certainly is related. The transgender movement. And here I want to clearly indicate that I'm not talking about gender dysphoria, a psychological designation for people who struggle with their identity, but I'm really talking about the cultural movement that we are experiencing, what some are calling trans theory. And by the way, I have the image here of a book that just came out actually about 10 days ago, The Body God Gives by Robert Smith, an Australian theologian, a very, by far the most in-depth analysis I've seen. I'm not even through it yet because I just got it on last Friday, and have been reading it over the last few days. A very in-depth theological analysis of transgender theory and the whole transgender cultural movement, which is essentially arbitrarily deciding on one's sex and what to do with one's body based on a concept of autonomy. Kathleen Stock writes, "Gender identity, not sex, is what determines whether you are a man or a woman or neither." Autonomy is very much at the heart of this. And so I think it's safe to say that autonomy has had a profound impact on bioethics. Nothing outside the human self to determine the right, good, and the just, including God being left out of the picture. It assumes that humans flourish best not in community or in accordance with defined essences such as human nature, but rather in accordance with an autonomous self. And I suggest to us that that runs counter not just to a Christian ethic, but to most historic ethical systems. So what is the alternative I pose? Well, as you would probably guess, it is human dignity. And it probably is only appropriate to talk about this in light of the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity here on Trinity campus, and that Dr. Kilner played such a significant role in its development, its leadership for over a number of years. Obviously, human dignity, as we know, is rooted in the image of God. I always like to point out it is also rooted in the incarnation, for the very fact that God took on human flesh and came among us is an affirmation of the worth and the value of Christ. And by the way, I think increasingly we're seeing writings, which I very much welcome, in which we're seeing connections between Christology and theological anthropology. And I think this is one area where we certainly can understand that. Every person then has an intrinsic value and significance to be guarded in every phase of life. And I contrast an intrinsic value compared to a functional value or a functional dignity. In a functional dignity, it is based on one's rationality, relationality, perhaps their own desire to live, their desire or their ability to experience some of the beautiful and good things of human life. And when those things are no longer there, then they are said to no longer have the same value and dignity. In contrast to that, the biblical version is an intrinsic value, an intrinsic dignity. Human dignity, of course, resides in the context of relationships, a community of other image bearers. Human dignity, as we know, doesn't ensure one does the right, but it grounds the right, the good, and the just when we're dealing with the field of bioethics. What is the impact then of human dignity? Well, I think it really calls for informed consent. And I would much rather have the concept of human dignity in place rather than autonomy when we're talking about informed consent for patients in the medical world. It guards against coercion of the patient, and I think really guards against it with much greater richness than, say, autonomy does. It protects against medical paternalism, and it guards against unethical practices which emerge from autonomy that we've just talked about, such as the reproductive revolution, abortion, posthumanism, medical assistance in dying, and transgender theory. But we might ask the question, is dignity really viable in today's secular world? Let me make just a few comments on that. I think it's helpful to remember that in 1948, following the atrocities of World War II and all that happened in Nazi Germany, the United Nations did a universal declaration of human rights that grounded human rights in the inherent dignity of all human beings. And the document says this, the preamble starts with this language: recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Then in Article 1 of the Declaration, the theme emerges again. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Jacques Maritain, a Roman Catholic philosopher, was among a group of individuals who were invited to come in together and look at this document and kind of weigh in on its clarity and were the concepts rich and full and did it make sense, etc. And at one point, he reports that during the conversation, someone said, "Isn't it amazing in this incredibly diverse ideological spectrum here that we can agree on this document talking about human dignity and basic human rights?" Somebody else popped up and said, "Yeah, as long as we don't ask why." But the very fact that they could agree on the language, I think, points to the fact that even though we have all of this expressive individualism, and though autonomy has become the driving force for many individuals in bioethics today, some ground might be able to be gained in the area of talking about human dignity. Or I think about the 2008 President's Council on Bioethics, which published Human Dignity and Bioethics. The group was led by Leon Kass from the University of Chicago, and then later on by Ed Pellegrino, who had an awful lot of input into the center here at Trinity, and on various occasions we had him as part of conferences. Just a wonderful, wonderful person. Interestingly, that council was made up of a pretty broad assortment of thinkers, at least religiously. It had Jewish persons, it had Roman Catholic, it had Protestants of various stripes, it had some who were not religious, though I think it's probably safe to say that most of them at least affirmed an essence to human nature and to the nature of medicine. At least that's my reading of the individuals who formed the commission. To be sure, there were critics such as Steven Pinker from Harvard, who wrote an article called The Stupidity of Dignity, in which he wrote that it was too nebulous a term, but he didn't do the same kind of critique on the concept of autonomy. Furthermore, I think we could say that dignity has viability in that we all want to be treated with dignity and as having value. It seems to me that every person on earth, deep down in, has a desire to be treated as something special. But even if the secular world rejects intrinsic dignity, I would suggest to us that Christian faithfulness requires it. As Augustine said in The City of God, God created man with a nature midway between angels and beasts. We were something unique, and Blaise Pascal echoed the same. Man is neither angel nor beast. As I often like to put it, as human beings, we are wonderfully made in the image of God, and we are terribly fallen, and we are finite. And those three understandings really inform much of our thinking. I'm right now working on a book on government and politics. I mean, what a time to be writing a book on this. But one of the things that I try to lay out in thinking about a theological anthropology is that we're wonderfully made, terribly fallen, and finite, and that tripartite understanding of human nature needs to feed into how we think about political and governmental life. The value and intrinsic worth of human beings is the most viable category, then, I think, for addressing the complex bioethical issues of our time. It is the best alternative to autonomy. I think all of us are enriched when we are committed to what the psalmist wrote in Psalm 8. What is humanity that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. You've made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. And it is that glory and honor that we seek as evangelical Christians to incorporate in the messy, complex world of bioethics. I pray that God will give us the strength and the wisdom to do precisely that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hollinger. We now have some time for some questions, so feel free, those of you that are joining online, please feel free to submit those questions into the YouTube streaming chat. So, just to kick us off a little bit, a few threads that you had mentioned earlier that just want to ask you if you'd like to tease out a little bit. You indicated the seemingly fateful usage of autonomy when that was chosen to be one of the four principles. Thinking in terms of the broader context that bioethics was emerging within in those early years in the wake of the Nuremberg Code and its seeming more emphasis on consent and the aspects not to be forced upon, to be able to withdraw, those sorts of things. Also knowing that one of the authors of Principles of Biomedical Ethics was also involved in the Belmont Report, authoring that, and they chose respect for persons instead of autonomy. How might you have seen that developing differently if that term had not been specifically?
Yeah, and I wish that the Belmont Report had really been, because that gets much closer to it, respect for persons. Obviously, I think some of the pushback on human dignity is a feeling that it is too close to religious sentiments. And so some of the pushback is precisely much more of a secular kind of pushback. And yet, as I talked about there at the end, I do think there is this sense in which, I just find it very fascinating that in 1948, after you experience all of the atrocities that were experienced, and all of the misuses of medicine, of course, that transpired during the Nazi regime, as people are beginning to reflect on that, they could use the term dignity. I don't know that there was another alternative at that point when Beecham and Childress wrote in 1977. Obviously, this is in the context, we just had Roe v. Wade in 1973. We have just in 1975 had the Karen Ann Quinlan case in death and dying, which propelled the whole issue of death and dying cases into the spotlight in American society. And this is before the reproductive technology. This is before Louise Brown, who I think came in 1979, if I recall correctly. And so we're just beginning to engage in all of this. We have, of course, the Tuskegee terrible, terrible thing that happened in terms of using human beings as simply pawns, if you will. All of that is background to it. But it was very much a new field. I mean, we wouldn't have thought, John, in 1977 of having a Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity. I mean, you and I were still in school. We were just starting our doctorate. You were at Gordon-Conwell probably about that time, right? And I was starting my doctoral work. And so all of this was so new. And I can understand how autonomy came to the fore. What I've often wondered is how much Roe v. Wade and the right to privacy spilled over into the language of autonomy. We'll probably never know that. I don't know that there would have been another alternative other than the sense of respect of persons, which I think in itself is very different than a sense of autonomy. It's just, to me, it seems like it's the wrong category because it pulls the individual out from being a communal being. Yeah. And Hannah Arendt is not a Christian, but she writes about the social nature of human beings and how pivotal that is to life in society and to democratic patterns of life.
I think in terms of the way that you unpacked the Beecham and Childress understanding of autonomy in terms of this freedom from coercion and how difficult that ends up being, this more libertarian interpretation. And one of the reasons why I think of the four principles, that one often has the most difficulty translating outside of the American context. Yeah. Thank you on that. Some questions from our online audience. The one is just as you were unpacking some of your discussion on autonomy, context, biblical response, Genesis 3:5 is the genesis of the sin of autonomy. If you want to respond, if that's discussed in your book at all.
Remind me what Genesis 3:5 is.
So let's see, I pulled it up.
I have a lot of verses memorized, but that's not one of them.
For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's that's a helpful point. I think you can say that the original sin was a sin of autonomy. They thought they knew it better. As they gave in to the tempter, it was a sense, the tempter says, you will then have greater wisdom and knowledge, okay? And that is appeal to that kind of self-delusion that we are alone, we don't need God, we don't need anyone else. And I think a good case can be made. Augustine and many others often talked about pride as the original sin. I've often felt that autonomy was the original sin, that sense of being autonomous from God and God's designs for us.
Thank you. Any questions for the audience here? Yeah.
I have a question because I'm right now working on a paper on end-of-life issues
Mm-hmm.
from the perspective, not finalize it, but from the perspective kind of like autonomy. So I'm really glad that you mentioned today. So, because you mentioned that autonomy has some good things,
Mm-hmm.
such as informed concept, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just thinking about what is the kind of the difference between this kind of, I mean, the expressive individualism of autonomy and the good thing about the autonomy, which is informed concept. Is there kind of like a balance between it, especially when we talk about end of life kind of like
Yeah.
decisions?
If you could frame it for our online people.
Yeah, the question, let me see if I can frame it. When we deal with end-of-life issues, you're saying, isn't the concept of autonomy a really helpful one? Is that what you're saying? I mean, in terms of
Informed concept.
in terms of informed consent. And yes, I mean, that's a positive offshoot of it. I think what I would suggest to us is that you don't need the category of autonomy in order to have informed consent. I think you can say, we want to have informed consent. A doctor can say, I want my patient to fully understand the alternatives if they choose this particular measure or refuse this particular measure on the basis that we value that person as human person. Okay? Now, ideally, because we're communal beings, I would hope that the patient has friends, if they're married, a spouse or family members that they also run this by, because we really gain much richer wisdom with the concept of other friends surrounding us and helping us think about it. And so, yes, the outcome of informed consent that came out of autonomy was a good thing. I'm just suggesting to us, and this I think is the fundamental thrust that I wanted to get across, that human dignity could have done that even better and much more, in a much richer fashion, and would have precluded all of these other abuses that I talked about in the realm of bioethics this evening. Does that make sense? Yes. Yeah. So that I don't think you need autonomy. That's another way of putting it. I'm not sure that you need autonomy in order to postulate informed consent.
Hey, Dennis, thanks for that presentation. That was really insightful. And I'm wondering, in terms of then the challenge to us is we would want to, let's say, make things better in the world, based upon this recognition. Mm-hmm. I think we can probably recognize, and you presented so well, that we could foster or champion dignity on a biblical theological basis. And I guess the question becomes how we should think about promoting dignity outside of the church context. Yeah. In other words, is this merely an evangelistic enterprise in which we say to the world, you have autonomy, you have separateness, but you have no significance, and we have something to offer. Mm-hmm. Human dignity has something to offer, that you don't have. Or are there ways that we can, without people having to accept a theological framework, are there ways that we can foster or promote dignity? I guess it's kind of implicit in what you said, but I'm just interested.
No, I think there are, John, and it gets back to one of my hobby horses, if you will, in ethics, and that is that in the public arena, we have to learn to be bilingual. When I'm attempting to make a point in the ethics committee in which I sit, there are 20 of us or so on the committee. There are only probably 3 of us that I know of who are believers. This is Bible Belt, Charlotte, North Carolina. And so in that context, I can't quote scripture and verse. I can't appeal to theologians. Everybody knows who I am, my background. Anybody can go online and see stuff I've written and so forth, and they know what I stand for. But obviously, when we're dealing with particular cases, I have to be bilingual and use a broader kind of language. And so I have found that at least as a helpful framework. And it's a thing I've really tried to impress upon my students, that when they are engaging in the larger world outside the church, They need to find categories in language, and I think you can do that. You can talk about human dignity. I mean, the human dignity language in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights makes no reference to God, makes no reference to any religious categories whatsoever. It's simply dignity, value kind of language of human beings. And I think we can talk about that in the sense of that we all want to be treated that way. I gave a lecture in the ethics group of the American College of Surgeons, I think it was, back in all these different groups of medical groups. These days, they all, when they have their annual meetings, have to have an ethics component. Not everybody has to go to it, but they got to have an ethics component. That's just required. That's understood. And so somehow I got asked to do this. And I dealt with the concept of dignity. And I simply said, now as a Christian, obviously I bring my own particularities to that. And then I went on, I didn't say anything more about my Christian faith. Now what was interesting is a lot of people afterwards wanted to talk. I mean, the Christians descended upon me. You know, they were glad to know that I was a Christian, and they could tell, they knew from my background. But there are others who wanted to engage, and then it opens the way, it seems to me, for the richer, fuller Christian categories, the theological categories, if you will. And so with human dignity, I think I would simply say something like, all of us really want to be treated as people with great value. We all have this sense that there's something unique about us as human beings. We want to preserve that. And we can move from there then, I think, then to talking about some of the specific aspects, say, of bioethics. That's kind of the way I handle it. That doesn't mean, by the way, that we hide our faith. It simply means that to get a hearing in the secular arena, I think we have to have an awful lot of wisdom and have to recognize we're just probably not going to be invited back, and we're not going to be able to engage in the larger discourse that goes on if we can't find that other kind of language to describe the things we're ultimately committed to. Now, when it comes to salvation, I've got to talk specific language, okay? But that's going to be a different arena than in a bioethics committee or in some kind of a public forum on political life.
So this is a question from one of our online participants. It speaks to this issue of when autonomy comes into conflict because of issues of rights and specifically conscience protections related to the autonomy of the patient versus the rights of the conscience for the healthcare professional. If you want to speak into that at all.
Yeah.
And then also more specifically, the question was, do we need more legislation to protect conscience issues for physicians?
Yeah, I mean, a lot in many different arenas about this today. What happens here is secularity becomes a new ism, if you will. It becomes a new religion in a sense. And I think in those kind of cases where people are forced into certain practices that go against their conscience, I think we have strong constitutional appeals. I think we can make strong philosophical appeals that we don't want to impose that upon any individual. And I think simply the right of religion and the freedom of conscience, which we value, and I think we appeal to it in that way. We don't have to talk about the language of the rightness and the truthfulness of the gospel of Jesus Christ, though you and I deeply, deeply believe that. But at that point, we are simply talking about the right of human beings who ought not to be coerced into a particular practice that goes against their conscience. And I do think that perhaps some legislation, if it doesn't work, I think it's always best to try to preclude the legislation if possible. That is, to get enough sentiment at the local level and in hospitals and in schools, institutions, and communities to move in that direction. But if we have to have legislation, then we have to move in that way to protect the rights of conscience. But I'm going to also say we have to protect the rights of conscience of all human beings. And I think that's the thing we have to, a lot of Christians aren't willing to do. I'll just use a personal example. I was involved in a church-state case many, many years ago over a cult that I totally disagreed with in their theology. And it had to do with the taxation issue in a local environment where they were trying to be taxed because they didn't have conventional churches. They lived in a communal existence. And therefore, the local jurisdiction said they don't get tax exempt. I was asked by a Christian lawyer who was working on the case whether I would come in and talk about, the rights of religion, et cetera. And I took that case on. Now, I haven't committed my life to many of those sorts of things, but I did that simply because I treasure the freedom that all human beings have. So I will vouch for the freedom for a Muslim to act upon their own particular commitments, all right? Even though I think Islam is wrong, all right? And it's not what I've committed my life to, but I think if I'm going to articulate a defense of conscience for Christians, I've got to also defend that for people of other religions and other isms as well. At least that's my own version. And I know there are Christians who get a little antsy with that, but I really think that that's important in the pluralistic world that we live in today.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions for those joining in person? So we have one final comment online. So actually two. The first is in the context of dignity with death, as used by the proponents of MAID. How would you help to bring clarification? Because you're obviously using dignity in a very different sense. And so how would you recommend to those engaged in the public square to bring about awareness of how this is being employed in a very different way?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And in a sense, they've kind of co-opted the language from us, dignity with death, meaning an autonomous death that I choose to have. I think in these kind of situations, and I think of when Edmund Pellegrino was with us, John, back in one of his occasions with the center. He said, physician-assisted suicide is not dignified. And he went on to actually describe what transpires in that. That's not a dignified death. I mean, that's kind of an objective kind of response to it. I think that we also recognize that when people are choosing death, they are never doing that alone. It's always involving, and that's why medical assistance language. The physician-assisted suicide sounded to many people too much like, it was the doctor doing the killing. Medical assistance in dying seemed to soften the blow a little. It's simply an assistance, giving them what they need to take their own life. But the fact is, it's incorporating another person. And so it's never purely an autonomous act. And I think that's one of the things to point out. Many of these acts that we say are autonomous acts are never purely autonomous in nature.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Hollinger again for a very stimulating presentation this evening. Also want to, again, welcome you back in 2 weeks for our next lecture in the Spring Bioethics Colloquium Series, April 3rd with Peter Jaggard, and then again on April 10th with Gregory Webster. For those of you here in person, we have some refreshments over in the front of the library, so feel free to stick around, and then we'll connect with those in joining for the class at 8:45 via Zoom. So thank you again.